Objection 2. Should not Episcopalians have the benefit of a toleration in Scotland, as was pleaded in Assembly by members in 1724, as well as Presbyterian Dissenters in England? Should not every man live according to the light of his own conscience, etc.? Answer. A toleration of all religions is the very cutthroat and ruin of all true religion, and contrary to our blessed Lord's example given for purging and keeping pure his house. It is what Satan boldly pursues for, and glories in, as the only bulwark of his kingdom. As for Presbyterians being tolerated in England, if they were standing upon their ancient basis, valiantly contending for the glorious Reformation that nation attained, and is sworn in the most solemn manner to maintain, in opposition to prelacy and all other heresies and errors, etc., they in that case had a just title and claim unto the ancient establishment, when prelacy was trodden under foot, and even as the matter is with them, they ought to be sound in the faith, with the Apostle Paul, to plead the truth and soundness of their doctrine, who, though frequently under persecution, did always plead against toleration. Galatians 5 verses 11 and 12. Christ and his apostles, when convened before magistrates, never made use of that defense, that a toleration in religion, be what it will, was due from the civil magistrate, but still pleaded the truth of their doctrine. Now was Elijah the less zealous against false prophets, 1 Kings 18:40, that there was a Jezebel ready to persecute himself, 1 Kings 19 verse 2, and so ought they, dissenters in England. For I judge the prelates and their underlings chargeable with idolatry, as well as Jezebel's or Jeroboam's priests, in regard there are idols of the understandings, as well as idols of the hand. Hosea 13 verse 2. That is, that not only does the workman's hand frame an image by which he worships God, and in which he approaches unto God, but likewise the idolatrous proud mind, when it forgetteth ways and inventions in the service of God, to beautify it, or, as more convenient, it makes an idol. And therefore, that human invention of a constant, fixed ordinary officer in the house of God, with a lordly power over his brethren, is an idol, though not of the hand, yet of the mind and understanding, out of which it is forged, and so is any other invention of man in God's service. And thus all human inventions corrupting the worship of God are all named by the name of images in the second command. It matters not, then, though people do not worship God by the idol with the hands, if they worship him by the idols made with the understanding. It was no great matter as to the guilt of idolatry, whether the idol that was worshipped was made by a smith or graver of stone, or of silver or gold, or whether it had the shape of a man or of a beast. It was all idolatry. So it is no matter if people worship God by an unlawful mean or idol or invention, whether that be the work of the hand or of the understanding. It is idolatry. And as not only Nebuchadnezzar nor Jeroboam only did sin in setting up the golden images or the two calves, but all such as either for fear or any other end did worship the golden image, or go to Dan and Bethel and sacrifice, were in like manner guilty thereof. Even so are the present king and rulers and bishops and their underlings not only guilty of superstition and idolatry, but setting up, inventing, and authorizing such an unlawful way of worship or idolatry. But all who join with them in the unlawful worship which proceeds from that unlawful authority, which is the idol of man's understanding, and the Dagon that is set up instead of the ark of God, in that and the neighbor nation, are likewise guilty. Hence Presbyterians in England are called to plead plainly and freely against this idol of jealousy that is there established, and so that the trumpet may not give an uncertain sound, and plead practically, and in deed, as well as in word, that so their conversation, by keeping at a distance from all that is corrupted, may be a living testimony against this idolatry and these other abounding corruptions. As to tolerating Episcopalians in Scotland to borrow their own weapons a little, it is contrary, firstly, to and consistent with, yea, a plain breach of the King's coronation oath and the act securing the Revolution Church, which is declared to be an essential and fundamental article of the Union Treaty, though I approve of neither. Number 2, to our solemn and sacred covenants, whereby instead of tolerating we are bound to extirpate prelacy, root and branch. And number 3, to our confession of faith and catechisms, books of discipline, and the whole tenor of the Scripture cited above. Furthermore, as to men walking according to the light of their consciences, it is to be considered, conscience is not the rule ruling, but to be ruled by the Word. So that when we say men should walk according to their conscience, we are still to understand it of a conscience well informed, and in the exercise of duty, as, quote, knowing its master's will and doing it. And as men's consciences are not their supreme rule, nor lawless things, so liberty to err and seduce, to vent lies and father them upon the God of truth, etc., is no part of that liberty purchased to us by the death of Christ, but it is in effect the captivity and snare to be entangled therewith. 2 Timothy 2, verses 25 and 26, and 2 Timothy 3, verses 6 and 7, and to be servants to corruption under pretense of liberty, 2 Peter 2, verse 19. Yea, to father this upon Christian liberty favoreth rankly of that old way of, quote, turning the grace of our God unto wantonness or lasciviousness, unquote. The mouths of heretics must be stopped. Their rejection and excommunication are recommended by precept and example. Titus 1, verse 10 and 11, Titus 3, verse 10, 1 Timothy 1, verses 19 and 20. I find churches censured by Christ himself for the neglect of discipline against false teachers, Revelation 2, verses 14 and 20, and others commended for their zeal in this particular, though found faulty, in other things, Revelation 2, verses 2 and 4. Furthermore, a lawful magistrate, instead of granting a promiscuous toleration to all heretics, heresies, and errors, which are great public sins and scandals, is appointed of God to be custos utriusque tabulae, entrusted with the concerns of God's glory, as well as man's interest, and therefore he is obliged to have a special and particular regard to these precious deposita in all his managements. What immediately relates unto God must be his chiefest care, for the honor of God does infinitely transcend the profit and advantage of man, and the soul is more precious than the body, and eternity is to be preferred to time. It is a criminal partiality to punish the cursing of an earthly father, yet to suffer the reproaching of a Trinity, to cut off a man for a treasonable word, yet let go unpunished the blasphemy of Christ, to hang a man for forging another person's hand, yet not to chastise a false prophet who uttereth gross and damnable lies in the name of the Lord, to punish a petty theft and not punish a man that endeavors to rob the great God of a son, and his son of his Godhead. See the essay upon toleration, printed in 1703. As the kings of Israel were obliged to put away the strange gods, Asa removed idolatry, and his mother for her idolatry, and commanded, quote, that whosoever should not seek the Lord God of Israel should be put to death, whether small or great, unquote, and of whatever sex. Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, and Josiah are highly commended for removing the high places, groves, images, etc., and other godly kings are sadly blemished for the neglect thereof. Consider Ezra 6, verses 11 and 14, and Ezra 7, verses 26 and 27. So it is one of the special duties which characterizeth and pointeth out a lawful and faithful magistrate under the New Testament dispensation, to punish evildoers, for the powers that are of God or are ordained to him to be a terror to evildoers, to be revengers, and to execute wrath upon them. Romans 13, verses 1 through 6, and 1 Peter 2, verses 13 and 14. But false teachers, such as papists, prelatists, and their underlings, Quakers, etc., are certainly such. Philippians 3, verse 2. They are called evil workers, dogs, etc., who fling dirt on that attribute of God's veracity and truth, and destroy souls, etc., and so are not to be tolerated. Reason 8. Presbyterian dissenters seem to have just ground to refuse communion with this present church, in regard she hath taken the illimited oaths to the government, put in place of the covenants, national and solemn league. I offer a few instances to illustrate the assertion which seems undeniable. Number 1. This Revolution Church did swear the illimited oath of allegiance, as appointed by the last article of the Claim of Right, to be taken by all Protestants instead of all other oaths and declarations which might be required by law, abrogating all other oaths, which Claim of Right, the great darling of the Church, was afterwards ratified by Parliament, that is, in June 1689. Now, this oath of allegiance is, number 1, unlawful as wanting scriptural qualifications requisite in swearing, Jeremiah 4, verse 2, and void of these due limitations in the covenants, national and solemn league, that is, quote, to preserve the king's majesty, person, and authority in, note carefully, the preservation and defense of the true religion and liberties of the kingdoms, unquote, etc. Number 2, our sacred covenants, especially the Solemn League and Covenant, the people's oath of allegiance at the admission of Charles II, and established by laws previously made, which by law might be required, are hereby plainly excluded and abrogated. This oath seems to be put for and instead of all others, without exception of the said covenants. Number 3, as in the said article of the claim of right, the estates required all other oaths to be abrogated. So the Parliament, William and Mary, Session 1, Act 2, June 1689, quote, do retreat, retract, and rescind all preceding laws and acts of Parliament, in as far as they impose any other oaths, etc., whereby our covenants, with acts and laws imposing them, seem to be plainly excluded, retreated, and rescinded. Number 2. This church foresaid did likewise take and subscribe the oath of assurance made and imposed to secure the government wherein the possessor of the throne de facto is sworn to be king or queen, also de jure, although void of these scriptural qualifications expressed in our best laws, 1649, as requisite in all kings and queens that should reign over these covenanted lands, both which oaths of allegiance and assurance, considered in their complex nature, with the relative acts of Parliament imposing them, seem to have a native tendency to establish practical Erastianism, if they be not in themselves directly Erastian, seeing the 23rd Act of the 4th Session of Parliament 1693, entitled An Act for Settling the Quiet and Peace of the Church, expressly statutes and ordains, quote, that no person be admitted for hereafter to be a minister or preacher within this church, unless that he having first taken and subscribed the oaths of allegiance and assurance, unquote, etc. Now, as no unlimited oath is due to any creature on earth, so it seems plain that these Erastian anti-scriptural oaths were required of and sworn by ministers as ministers, no ministerial qualifications in place of our covenants. Number 3. This church showed great unfaithfulness and treachery and at the oath of abjuration, as, firstly, when it was required to be taken by all persons in public trust about the year 1706, she used endeavors to have ministers exemed, but did not, like faithful watchmen, discover the sin and danger thereof to their people, but gave way to their taking it, until the most part of public persons were ensnared. Secondly, when this oath came, as a woeful fruit of the Union, to be imposed on ministers at the Assembly, 1712, the result of their reasonings and debates about it seems to have been, quote, that every one in this matter should walk according to his light, and that none should condemn another, though of a different practice, unquote. By which sinful compact and lax conclusion all were left to look on as a thing indifferent, exposed to the taking of it, and many fell into the snare. Quote, the prophets not discovering the iniquity brings on the captivity, and their seeing false brethren becomes a cause of banishment, unquote. Lamentations 2, verse 14. It is noticeable that this church, when jealousing that this oath might possibly be imposed on them, did in their address to the Parliament of Scotland anon 1706 supplicate for preventing it, declaring it to be inconsistent with and contrary to Presbyterian principles, whereupon they obtain the Act of Security above mentioned, which act expressly declares in statutes, quote, that none of the subjects of this kingdom shall be liable to, but all and every one of them forever free of any oath, test, and subscription within this kingdom, contrary to or inconsistent with the said Presbyterian principles, and that the same within the bounds of this church and kingdom shall never be imposed upon or required of them in any sort, unquote. Nevertheless, this church, a few years thereafter, did, contrary both to their own representation and this express act securing from all oaths, etc., take, swear, and subscribe this unhappy oath of abjuration. So great was their defection from, and desertion of, their pretended Presbyterian principles. I say, number 4, this abjuration oath, calculated for England to secure the succession to the crown, and the abjured prelatic church of that kingdom, was taken and subscribed by most ministers in this church, and the nonjurants are to be reputed soci criminis, i.e., brethren in iniquity, while they do not faithfully and freely declare and testify against the sin, perjury, and breach of covenant therein, and thereby contracted. The sinfulness of which oath has been clearly and sufficiently discovered in many prints, which the jurants were never able to answer, and appears in its being, firstly, an ill effect and homologation of the Union, Article 22, quote, it is declared and agreed that these words, this realm, the crown of this realm, etc., mentioned in the oaths, which were intended to signify the crown and realm of England, shall be understood of the crown and realm of Great Britain, and, in that sense, the said oaths shall be taken and subscribed, unquote, etc.